Hi everyone, welcome to Startupification, a podcast about how technology is changing the world around us with me, Matt Ferrigia, and my co-host, Stephen Drost. You can find out more about us, browse all the episodes, and view the show notes at startupification.fm. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, Stephen is at DrostyBoy, I'm at Matt Ferrigia, and the show is at startup_FM. Hi everyone, it's Matt here. We are joined this week by Mark Logan. Mark is, among other things, a startup and scale-up advisor and professor at the School of Computer Science at Glasgow Uni these days, but prior to that, he was, of course, the Chief Operating Officer of Skyscanner and helped grow them from 100 to 900 people and to a £1.5 billion exit valuation. So he has quite genuinely walked the walk when it comes to technology businesses. Our wide-ranging chat covers everything from education and ecosystems, playbooks in Silicon Valley, to maintaining staff agency and the grief cycle of change. There's tons of insight here from Mark to get stuck into, so I really hope you enjoy the show.
This is weird. I've literally never introed.
Would you like me to hold your hand?
No, okay. Hi Matt, how you doing?
Hi Stephen, I'm very well.
Good to hear it. Well, this is a bit of a different episode this week, as you can tell by the fact that I'm introducing it. We are super happy and honoured to have a guest with us here today, and we're actually in the same space, so we're looking at each other as well for the first time.
We are socially distanced but in the same space.
Exactly, very responsible podcasting. We have Mark Logan with us here today, and we're super excited about that. And let's just start off. Mark, would you be happy to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Sure. Well, very good to be here with you both today, Stephen and Matt.
Thank you.
Excellent introduction for a first time. So very briefly, so I started life as a software engineer in a BT research lab, and after a few years joined my first startup, and we eventually sold that startup to Cisco 5 years later. Then I spent a few years in Cisco, went to another startup, stayed there for a few years. There's a pattern building here. Eventually, I became the CEO at Skyscanner. And after 5 years there, and after we sold the business to C-Trip, I moved on to a new phase of my life, which now involves really trying to be one of a number of people contributing to the ecosystem here in Scotland, the tech ecosystem. And I feel especially focused on that because all the way through my now 30 years in this sector, which is embarrassing to say, but all the way through that time, people would, not everybody, but a lot of people would tell me that you can't really grow a big tech company in Scotland, or you've got to be in one of the major centres. And I've really enjoyed being part of teams that have proven that not to be the case. And I want to continue to help other teams do the same. So that's my, in a summary, that's my current interest.
Great. Thanks very much. So that means we have a guest here today who has been part of a unicorn. And
should we ring a special noise when that happens?
Yeah, exactly. No, but I think it's an important word to use here, because I think there's a lot of stuff we can hang on that. I don't think there are that many unicorns. So listening to someone who's actually been through growing a company that started off small, then scaled, and got to a certain size. That's a super interesting conversation to have. But second of all, I think unicorns also lend themselves to be understood against the backdrop of an ecosystem, and ecosystems are something that Matt and I talk about a lot. And so for today, I think it'd be really great, Mark, to get your views on what's an ecosystem, what are the components of an ecosystem, what do good components look like, what's the good constellation of those components, and what does it take for an ecosystem to exist to create a unicorn, frankly. That would be a great way of putting it. And another piece that I know Matt and I are super interested in as well is education. So if we could talk today a little bit about ecosystems on the one hand and education on the other. Playbooks, metaphors, all the good stuff that we're always obsessed with.
And you won't mind me saying this, Mark. You're a very smart guy, but you're not just ad-libbing this. You have done. You have recently quite. A lot of people may or may not know this, but if they're in Scotland, they know this. You did a review into the Scottish technology ecosystem for the government, an independent review. So this is front of mind for you. It's very much things that we care about and are interested in too. So it would be great to sort of chat through some of the areas that that I think I certainly found most interesting about our review, and Stephen did too, because there's a lot of crossover, but there's a lot of, you had to be on your best behaviour producing that report. I'm sure you had to cut a lot of stuff out of it and focus. This is a chance for you to really drill into the things that you think are exciting and interesting, and we can drill back and kind of have a chat about that, if that's all okay with you.
All sounds great. Can I say a word on unicorns just
Sure.
for a second? In Skyscanner, we banned that word inside Skyscanner. And the reason we did that was because we wanted to make sure we were pursuing the right thing. And the right thing for us was building a company that was as strong as it possibly could be. And every day and every week was a little bit better than it was before. And the trouble with titles like unicorn inside a company is it creates hubris. It creates a sense of, we've arrived and aren't we great and all that kind of stuff. And that wasn't the culture that we wanted to instill. So, it just as an interesting side note, we never used the term, and we actively discouraged it. Unicorn status is a fleeting thing, but building a company that can continue to create employment, create a great product, give opportunity to people, that's the language we wanted to use. So I just make that point because often people over-index on unicorns, but it's the substance underneath that really matters.
No, you're right. We've discussed unicorns quite a great deal in the past, and with regards to ecosystems, are they a good sort of metric for an ecosystem? Are they a North Star metric in some ways? And frankly, there's an interesting thing going on in the UK at the moment, that the UK have kind of redefined unicorns, the UK government that is, from this classic measures where $1 billion valuation but achieved within 10 years, and the UK government's taken away the within 10 years piece, to sort of create a higher number of unicorns, so to speak. And as the German part of me is coming out here going, there's like 3 times as many unicorns in the UK as there are in Germany now by that measure, or the same goes for France or any other sort of European country. So deeply aware that it's an odd thing to focus on, but still I think growing a company and scaling a company and actually having been through it, I think it's super crucial to have a genuine conversation.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, there's a funnel, and as companies go through, get bigger, get more successful, there is a point where it narrows, and then you get fewer, more successful businesses. Whatever label you want to put on them, it doesn't really matter. I think what I found really interesting, engaging with the research that you'd done, is a lot of that discussion was around much earlier stage in the funnel. In fact, it was all the way through the funnel, but some of the fundamentals. And I think I'm right in saying one of the things you think is the biggest barrier to Scotland kind of creating more success at the end of the funnel is our education, or is what we're doing around education, not our education system, which is very good, but what we're doing around technology education. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? What do you think the challenges are?
Yeah, sure. So, if we start with what do we mean by an ecosystem, it's one of these words that has many different interpretations. So the first thing we've tried to do with the report is define a canonical model for that. And at the top level of that, you could view it as you said, Matt, a funnel. And at one end of that funnel, you've got all those 1 and 2 person, very early stage businesses, just early idea stage, not really a startup yet. And then as you move from there through startup to scale up to large scale up to unicorn and beyond, then of course that funnel narrows. And my view is that there's a natural narrowing rate of that funnel, because not every business that's a startup should become a scale up and so on. And there's enormous value in those earlier stages of the funnel. They employ an awful lot of people and so on. But in most ecosystems, the narrowing rate that's actually experienced is a lot less than the natural narrowing rate. Another way of saying that is that we leak companies and opportunity as we go along. So startups that could have scaled but couldn't find any engineers, or a scale up that couldn't grow because there wasn't enough expertise in how to run a company with 1,000 employees in that local ecosystem, so it doesn't continue to grow, and so on. Or many startups that lose their way and never find product market fit because they didn't really know how to do that, but they assumed they'd found it, so they hemorrhaged some money while they discovered that they hadn't. So funnels narrow too quickly. And let's assume, for example, we're here in Scotland today, that in the Scottish ecosystem, we have that problem. So what can be done about that? So I think that an ecosystem depends on three things. It depends on education. And by education, I don't just mean school education, though I do include that. I mean also founder education. What's the playbook for growing a company, for example? It depends on the social infrastructure and the physical infrastructure to support and nurture companies. And in that regard, social infrastructure for me is as important as physical spaces. The meetups that take place, the cross-learning that happens, the conferences where people get inspired and a sense of identity emerges. And then the final category after education and infrastructure is of course funding, which takes many forms. But in my view, education is the most important of those. And that might sound the opposite to what some people would expect, because we always talk about not enough funding and so on. But I know today in Scotland, if someone gave me £10 million to put into a grant fund for startups, I would struggle to find enough startups to get that money away. But if I put that £10 million into educating founders to be more equipped, then I'd have plenty of deal flow to spend subsequent funding money. So to me, education is key. And if you look at that subject, education, it itself is a funnel. So you start with trying to get children at school interested in tech and in computing, for example. And then at university level, assuming some people go on to do, for example, computing science or similar degrees, the challenge there isn't educating them in tech. The challenge is not producing just technicians out of university, but also producing tech entrepreneurs or people who are ready to go on that journey. And we don't do that today to such a great extent. Then at the startups themselves, I could stop almost any startup in this building today if people were here today, but in a sort of traditional sense, and ask people, what's the Silicon Valley playbook to create virality, or what's the right metrics to use for retention, as evidenced by the most successful companies out there. And a lot of people wouldn't know the answer to that, but it's not a trivial question. But if they did know the answers to that, the hit rates of success and the ability to grow would be much higher. So education for me covers that whole funnel.
Interesting. Could we anchor on Playbooks a little bit, Mark? Is that okay? What's your view of Playbooks? What comes to mind when you think about Playbooks?
So I'm a very deep believer in I use the term frameworks and models, because I found that if you don't have those very explicitly understood, so how does a business work? What's its business model? Is it a two-sided network? How do you operate a two-sided network, etc.? Then as humans, we tend to default to activity over outcomes. And we're all busy today, and that means we're doing the right stuff. But the intellectual content of that activity is reduced. And it's a great way to lose time and spend investors' money. So I think it's extremely important that at the outset and at every stage afterwards, that businesses are clear what the model is, what the framework is. And it can take many forms. One very simple form is you write an equation down for your business. What goes in, what are the intermediate conversion metrics, and what comes out. And that itself is enough to guide a huge number of decisions. Moving on from that, I think a level up from that is having a growth model. We'll call it gives different names and call it a growth model. So it's showing, what are the main feedback loops where customers attract other customers? How do we stimulate those? What are the metrics associated with retaining those customers? And these models are your strategy. Mm-hmm. And I think the more that we reflect on those things and make them explicit and instantiate them explicitly in our businesses, first qualitatively and then quantitatively. And the more everyone right out to the front line of the business really understands those models, I think the more successful, dramatically more successful our startups will be. I'll give you a very simple example. In Skyscanner for several years, and it's embarrassing to say it now in retrospect, but for several years, we were in a two-sided, well, actually a three-sided network, including advertisers, but we hadn't made that explicit within our thinking. And in retrospect, that's a big mistake. But because we were being pretty successful, success is a dangerous companion, because while it's walking with you, you get lazy on things. You don't apply the same rigor and the same paranoia, and then one day
It's not
success.
a great teacher, is it?
No, it's not. That's a very good way of putting it. And one day it decides to go off down a different road, and you find that you're not sufficiently ready, I should say, for the challenges and the details that really matter. So we didn't really understand our business model beyond a superficial level for a while. And it meant we started making bad decisions. Some of the decisions were by coincidence good and some were bad. But when we decided to regroup and really double down on the idea that we're a two-sided network plus advertising, so 2 + 1-sided network, and there's a playbook for that, and we started to rigorously follow that playbook, and we very, very consistently and relentlessly communicated that model to everybody in the company so we could all make the right micro decisions, things went a lot better for us.
Do you think that's... I'm intrigued by that because, I mean, I've heard a quote from you in the past, which I think chimes with this. It was, it's amazing how in retrospect you can do really dumb stuff because you didn't put an explicit intellectual model in place on how to grow your business. And I kind of wonder, where's the balance and the value of that? Is the balance in aligning everybody against the plan, or is the balance in this is just the one way to do it, and therefore we've learned from somebody else's mistakes, so we now know the way, or is the balance in there's a playbook, but actually we just needed structure around something that would turned into our own unique snowflake of a business? I mean, if it was always the same for all businesses, I mean, where would the challenge be, right? You would just replicate it. Yeah,
I think of those three options, it's the last one. It's the snowflake. But I'll use an analogy here from chess. So chess has obviously a set of rules, so your pieces move in a certain way. But a much deeper body of knowledge is the heuristics about how to play chess. What do you do in a given position? How do you win that type of position, etc. But even within that very deep body of knowledge, which if you want to be a great player, you've got to learn it. It's also one of the most creative human endeavours. So every day, grandmasters are playing games that are hugely creative. It's the same in business. If you don't know the rules, you don't last very long. If you don't know the heuristics, you spend a lot of time learning those heuristics, making mistakes because you often do things that are counter to what the heuristics told you, would have worked. If you do follow those heuristics, there's also then huge space to vary from those, but you're doing it from a position of understanding. So we are going to differ from this playbook because of these reasons. But before you have that rigor, you tend to do arbitrary things, and some of those will be aligned to your strategy, and some of those will be counter to it, but you won't know that. Or some of them will be ideas that didn't work for someone else, but you're going to make the same mistake. And, there's an awful lot of people out there, and I'll include myself in this, who made lots of mistakes in their first startups and are grateful for the education, but I doubt the investors are grateful for that education. Yeah. So, let's try to learn, but also be successful first time round. And I think for that, we do want to try and learn from the heuristics that are out there. So that's how I think about it.
Mark, where would you say those heuristics come from? Where do you find exposure to those heuristics? Maybe a thing Matt and I talk about a lot is looking at playbooks. I guess that would be a kind of heuristic analogy, and then mapping them to your specific situation. I guess that's what you're saying. With you mastering the basic heuristics and then becoming creative on it, or then making differences. Could you talk a little bit maybe about where we look to find playbooks and what it takes to adjust them to our particular situation?
Sure. So let's look at playbooks from a first principles. How do they emerge? Because the truth is, and this gets back a little bit to what I think Matt was saying in his last question too, the truth is almost every business is different from almost every other. Otherwise, why are you here? Because someone's already done it. And I think in that regard, it's important to realise that the need for a playbook is dynamic. So it's not like I've got one playbook and then I'm done. So yes, Skyscanner was a multi-sided network, but we also had to have a lot of additional playbooks, and a lot of those weren't actually available, at your local playbook DIY store.
Playbooks are us.
Although that could be a great business model as an aside. Yeah. But I want 10% if you start it, Stephen. So for example, let's look at a first principles example. The first time you experience a new situation, in the business setting, you have to figure it out from first principles. Now, I'm going to insert a step in there, which is the first time you experience a new situation, you see if anyone else has ever had it before. So you get on the web and you search. Not perfect, but you might find an answer, and in which case, great. But let's assume you can't. So the first time you experience something, you have to figure it out from first principles. The second time you experience it, it has to be a pattern. And I think we often fail to think that way. So, quite often we'll be figuring things out from first principles. I'll give you an example. So someone wants to buy the company. So the first time you're faced with that question, you're like, well, what are the pros and cons of that? And what sector are they in? And how would they treat our people afterwards? And so on and so forth. The second time you get an offer, assuming you didn't sell the first time, then you should have a framework for assessing that and make the assessment quickly so that you use limited cognitive energy. Because the trouble with busy people in a startup is your cognitive energy is precious and you can't be figuring everything out from first principles. So the first thing I would advise people to do is follow the rule of the first time it's first principles, the second time it's a pattern. And that will help you generally because your business has its own unique challenges. Now, the layer above that is, of course, you're not the first person to do that. So you can access patterns rather from, reading books. How did Google run its HR system, stuff like that, from talking to people in other companies at bigger scales, from formal training. And there's lots of good examples out there of how, the companies we all know and admire grew their businesses, how they made virality work. But you've got to be conscious that the task you're doing as an executive or founder or member of a team is you're trying to build up a huge pattern buffer. Mm-hmm. And those work at different scales. So for Skyscanner, it was okay, we've got a two-sided network, so let's make sure we understand that. That's table stakes. Mm-hmm. Within that, then we had a set of heuristics for, how do we get user-to-user growth to work? And a set of heuristics about should we treat our partners and what's the best way to work with them and what tools would make that work better. We just kept adding heuristics, and I find the most successful executives on a personal level are the ones who explicitly embrace building a set of models. Because have you ever been to a meeting where you say to somebody, should we sue those guys because they're trying to infringe our patents? And the person says no or yes, but the answer's immediate. And you think, well, how did you make that decision so quickly? And the answer is, it's already a pattern. They know the answer. So they're scalable people because they don't spend cognitive energy on working everything out from first principles. Now, there's a different class of people who never work anything out from first principles, and they make superficial decisions. So you need to understand the sequence is understand the first principles, then apply it as a pattern.
Wow. That's deep. That's deep, Mark. No, because you've just answered a bunch of stuff that's been floating around in my head for a while, from the combination of first principles thinking with playbooks and how do you change it. I think there's a quote that we might have said in one of the earlier episodes. Forgive me if I've already done that, Matt. But it's something like the novice sees 1,000 possibilities and the expert sees 2. And I guess that's what you're kind of alluding to, right? So that's sort of learning of exposing yourself to, well, I don't know how to do this, and I'll give it a bash. But once you've gone through that, do your research, understand those playbooks, and then build a structure that makes you faster going forward. I hate to do this, Mark, but I think people at this point, I think a lot of people don't get to this point, frankly, but when they do, they'll then start to say, hey, the place we can find all those playbooks, or the direction we should turn our eyes towards or our gaze towards is Silicon Valley. Have you got any thoughts on that?
I do. I will turn anywhere that I think's got something to teach me, provided that the morality of that source is compatible with mine. Now, for instance, in the report you referred to earlier, we make a lot of references to the Silicon Valley, and some observers have criticised that, saying, you're trying to import the Silicon Valley into Scotland, and there's good and bad things about the valley, and in any case, it's not realistic to import a very large-scale ecosystem into an early-stage ecosystem like ours. And with respect to those views, I think that's missing the point, because the point is that, and we'll take Silicon Valley as the best example, if you have a density of startups and scale-ups that's sufficiently high that best practice gets distilled out of that environment. So how does that work? Well, we've got 1,000 startups a year, let's say, and 900 of them fail because of all the things we've just talked about or for just downright bad luck. And let's say 100 of them do okay and 10 do really, really well out of that 100. Now, those 10 in every generation in the Valley tend to exhibit the same behaviours. So, for example, in the Silicon Valley was one of the earliest places to surface the idea of continuous delivery, for example. It was a concept that had existed in the manufacturing world for decades, but it eventually made its way via the Valley to software. Now, the point is that best practice, as it manifests in the tech world, will often appear first in the Valley just because of the density of companies. The great Darwinian forces that kill a bunch of companies, bring a few to the surface. The people in those companies move to other businesses, take that skill set, then it becomes a playbook, or to use your term earlier, Stephen. Now, it would be, I think, a mistake for countries like Scotland or anywhere else to ignore that because they don't like the smell of the Silicon Valley or whatever else. So when I talk about the Silicon Valley, I'm talking about let's import the techniques that have been born for how you do something in this current age. What's the right way to do mobile? What's the right way to do AI? Now, the Silicon Valley is increasingly not the only place where that emerges. We should be looking at other environments, which we don't tend to think about, like China, for example. There's a lot of startups in Beijing, a lot of startups in Shanghai, Shenzhen, etc. And but we don't tend to access them because there's a language barrier or whatever else. But we should be looking at those examples. How do they scale? How do they solve these problems? How do they iterate more quickly? So that's where I think the power of the Valley is. And when I was in Skyscanner, we often would remark to each other that if only we could just walk out of the company and pop down to see Twitter or Google and say, when you got to 500 people, what did you do right and what did you do wrong? Yeah. Because not because you guys are naturally superior and so on, but because the fact is you've gone through that pattern process I've just described and we haven't yet. So what we actually did do is we went over to the Silicon Valley and we knocked on LinkedIn's door and we asked the head of engineering, how do you do continuous delivery? What was hard about it? What did you find challenging? And that was enormously helpful for us. And we also popped over to see the folks in Spotify to ask them how they did certain things. So I'm not suggesting you can only do this in the Silicon Valley, but we need to recognise that the place on earth with the highest density of creation of best practice is a place we can't ignore. And quite often in the past, we've seen best practice from the Valley take 10 years to get to companies here. But the internet makes us compete with those companies, and I want to compete on a level playing field. And I like to think that in Skyscanner, for example, we took those practices and we iterated and improved them and adapted them to our needs. So I'm not advocating slavish devotion to other people's work, but you've got to source those patterns where they are.
Yeah, can I actually wind it back to your playbook discussion, because I think this is relevant. It'll take me a second to bring it back to relevant, but bear with me. I remember hearing Patrick McKenzie, who's a guy who works for Stripe, talk about one of Stripe's challenges, and that is that they're going through hyper growth, and therefore at any moment in time, half the people who work in that company didn't work in the company, like a year and a half ago. So they had to do a lot of work around playbooks, or documentation is how he described it, but effectively that means an internal playbook, I think, just so that they could get everybody on the right page. So there's an engine of educating a workforce massively in parallel on best practices happening in these massively hyper-scaling companies. And when you have an ecosystem that's as successful as Silicon Valley, I guess what you're getting is that times a factor of 1,000. I mean, it's like a network effect. I remember our very first episode, Stephen, you chastised me for using network effects as a metaphor to describe the metaphor of an ecosystem. But I do think there's an element there. You do get this kind of feedback loop, don't you, where you get lots of people. But how do you solve the cold start problem of that? So how does a place like Scotland, which doesn't have the critical mass of hundreds of smart people in companies who know how to do it the right way, then going out into other companies? Is that where education comes back in?
I think so. In an ideal world, you would have education and experience. And I think in Scotland, we're in the ecosystem, we're short on experience, so we've got to go long on education. And that works. I can tell you that works. But you've also just got to be thoughtful about what is it you're doing. So let me give you an example. We often talk about scaling companies, and a lot of people focus on the glitz of that, or getting the product out there. The truth is, it's a human problem. It's not a technology. Technology companies are not a technology problem. They're a people problem. And therefore, we've got to apply the same thinking to the organization as we do to product. So here's a question for you, a rhetorical question, which I will answer. When you're changing an organization because you're scaling, what is the variable you're optimizing for? Now, if I was to ask you that question in an engineering context, like, you want to buy a new car, do you want a sports car or the people carrier? Depending on your answer, I'd optimize for suggesting a bigger engine and a smaller boot, or I'd optimize for the other way around if you wanted a people carrier. When it comes to an organization, when you ask people why are they changing it, what is it you're doing with that structure chart? What variable are you actually optimizing for? Very few people can answer that question, but it's an engineering problem. So if you want to scale a company well, even in the absence of having a bunch of experienced managers who've done it before, you've got to just be able to answer that question. Now, in my view, what you're optimizing for is the agency of your frontline people. What does that mean? It means agency to me is not autonomy, because you can be incompetent and autonomous, and just very easy to become incompetent because the organization grew and I can't manage 20 people, but I could manage 2, so now I'm incompetent. Agency is about having the competence at the level you're at, which implies intensive ongoing education for your people in a scaling company about the models for how to manage bigger teams. It implies that you know what you own, and you've got the ability to make decisions on that without interference. You know where to go for the things you don't have responsibility for, and you understand the general strategy of the business. Now, I like to think about, on day one, if the 3 of us started a company, our agency index is 100, because we know all those things. I'm the engineering director, your marketing director, product director. We know what we own. We are the resources. We know the strategy because we sit here all day and talk about it. So we're 100 out of 100. But employee 105 or 210, her agency index is not 100 because we didn't take time to explain the strategy. She's not that sure what she owns because she thinks Jeff in the other building might also own a bit of this process and they're going to have to negotiate. She doesn't know where to go for answers. We're too busy to tell her because we're busy fighting fires. So the agency of your people falls over time. And then we start to panic and say, let's change stuff, let's reorganize. But we're doing it without knowing that that's the variable we're optimizing for. Now, conversely, how I've tried to steer my ship in these cases is always to ask, if I'm making a change to the business, what does that do to the agency index? Does it make it fall, rise, or stay the same? And a piece of advice I'd give everybody growing anything is try to instantiate that concept in your thinking and just try and get a qualitative feel for what way is the agency going if I make a change. And before you make changes, ask, is agency falling as we hire new people? Is agency going down? And if you do that, even if you haven't got the direct experience of having run a larger company, because we all have to get that experience the first time, then you'll generally make good decisions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and you're triggering several traumatic memories.
Sorry, Stephen.
I had the biggest company. I built a company once that we had about 160 employees, and that was the height of my experience. And it was pretty dysfunctional, frankly, and it was really, really difficult. One of the things that I didn't appreciate back then at all, and it might be interesting to get your view on this, is, so you mentioned agency, and agency is it's a word where you can imagine something by it, but it's also kind of difficult to sort of package it, explicitly together. So it'd be good to hear what you mean by that a little bit more. But can you, if this is not too bizarre a request, can you link agency somehow to iteration? So the thing I didn't realize back then was we grew so fast that I just thought everything was kind of solid, if you know what I mean. And I was scared of fluidity. I thought that when we didn't know something, that was a bad thing, and iteration's bad. I just wanted to go, no, just do this. Everyone just do this. And I didn't optimize for agency at all. It was just like, how do we get more people, or just all the wrong stuff that I'm sure you you can imagine. So is there any way you can link? Because it strikes me that if you're a smaller thing, so earlier you said, employee number 105, that employee wouldn't know how to do things. I talk to some large corporations sometimes, and the way I say it to them is like, there's a huge difference between employee number 1, employee 100, 1,000, and if you work for Vodafone or something, you're employee 427,372, and they all have a completely sort of different understanding, I guess, of ownership, agency, but also iteration for me, because the later you come in, the less you understand iteration, I think. Or maybe that's not true. But it strikes me that when people talk about startups and ecosystems, frankly, they underestimate the power of iteration. And they think that, for example, the whole conversation around Silicon Valley, that you just import that stuff in, don't iterate on it, and just sort of, mimic it or act it out or something. So could you maybe talk a little bit about iteration?
Yeah, certainly it's a very interesting point. So, one of the tenets of what I call internet economy thinking is that speed of iteration is extremely important. So the faster you can iterate, and this is maybe a cliche for those of us in tech, but the faster you can iterate, the faster you can correct mistakes and so on. So we often think about iteration in terms of getting releases out to the market, but we often forget to apply the concept to the evolution of the organization. So the organization has to be able to iterate at speed as well. Now, the problem is that we're hardwired as humans, I believe, to want everything as it is just now to stay the same. A great example of that, I think it was Leibniz, a famous mathematician who was co-credited with Newton for inventing calculus. He was looking at the world at the time where there was executions galore and disease and terrible living conditions, and he was trying to square that with how could God allow this to be the case, and then he reasoned that it's because, good or bad, this was the best of all possible worlds.
Monadic theory. You're triggering me again. Yeah, come on.
Exactly, yes. And but I've always found that a really valuable concept, because he had rationalised to align different theories that this was the universe's optimum state, the best of all possible worlds. Now, the truth is that we all think that way. No matter how good or bad things are in a company, I might complain about it, but if someone comes along and says, why don't we change this, then your immediate reaction is, don't change it, because it could get even worse. So it's the best of all possible worlds. So really, when we talk about iteration organisation, we're really talking about let's have another index, what's the propensity for accepting change within the team? And I think you've got to engineer that. Now, how do you do that? Well, I'm fond of observing that drivers in a car never get sick. Have you noticed that? But the passengers do. So you really want a company of drivers. And to get that company of drivers, people hate things being visited upon them. Yes, you do have to make wholesale org changes every so often, but a great thing to do is have the organisation evolve, because people in the front line can drive that evolution. They can see what's broken. They can raise that and be part of the fixing process. And I think managers going through change need to recognise that bringing people with you isn't just about a great speech. It's actually about genuinely involving them in the process of change, and encouraging people to provoke the organisation to change, because then people are drivers. So that's useful. And I also think that you owe it to yourself to change certain aspects of your organisation regularly so that people are used to the concept. And I'll give you an example, which I don't know if this is controversial or not, but when I joined Skyscanner, one of the first things I did was every 6 months change the entire seating plan. And I don't think people love that.
People hate that.
They do, but why I was doing that? Partly because I wanted people to get used to the idea that stuff changes. And I'd come from an environment where there was a group of engineers in one of the buildings and they hadn't moved desk for 10 years. Now, I don't want to know what was in those engineers' drawers, but I'm certain it wasn't good. But when they were asked to move, there was it seems absurd, but there was a massive mutiny about it. You can't expect us to move desks every 10 years. Yeah. And I was thinking, if people feel that, then are they going to accept any other changes? So I wanted to instill a rhythm into the business that things do change, and people have got to be comfortable with that. But I also wanted to instill into the business that you need to be responsible for changing them as much as possible. There's a great line from Moby Dick, which is that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that the sailors at the front of the ship smell a change in the wind first. The captain at the back of the ship thinks he does, but he senses it second. You want your sailors at the front of the ship to not only sense a change in wind, but be able to do something about it or have the access channels to do so. So speed of iteration and organizational change, in summary, is let's get people used to the concept, and that's not easy to do, but it's important. Let's enable people to drive change as much as be subject to change. And then let's recognise that change is a grief cycle. Yeah. And you can only go at a certain speed. So there's a maximum grief cycle speed you can go at. And you've got to take people through that grief cycle. And to me, that is the limiting factor. How quickly can people move from disorientation to anger or remorse at something that's moved on to acceptance and driving? So there's a lot we could talk about that. But an organisation that can go at that speed, I think, works very well. When you see companies try to move below that minimum grief cycle speed, that's when they get big problems and morale plummets.
Can I sort of change gears on this a little bit, because I'm going to say something controversial. You can sort of push back and glare at me if you wish, but I don't think that growing companies from 105 to whatever next stage, tech companies, is necessarily it's something that we want Scotland to be able to do, but I'm not sure it's our biggest problem. I'm not even sure how many 105 person tech companies we actually have in Scotland. If I was being if I was just being black and white, I might say, look, if you could solve us getting a bunch of 105 person tech companies, that'd be a good result. Do we need to do more, or do you think we've got plenty of those companies and we're just not seeing them? I mean, my sense is that we're not generating enough 105 person companies.
Yeah, I actually think at all stages of that funnel I was talking about earlier, Matt, the start up to scale up to large scale up, we don't have sufficient density of companies. And that's what I call a pre-tipping point ecosystem. And you guys talked about network effects earlier. What are network effects in a post-tipping point ecosystem? Well, I think there's three. The first one is that you can attract talent into the ecosystem. So, for example, senior engineers or executives who've been there and done it, and they in turn strengthen the ecosystem, which gives you more strong companies, which can attract more talent. Same thing with investment. And also you get a circulation of indigenous talent from the more sort of large-scale companies back into earlier stage companies. Young folks in Skyscanner who get more experience will leave that company and take more senior positions in earlier companies, for example. So you get these three loops running, and at that point you can almost step back from the ecosystem and let it run itself. So government interventions can be tapered back and so on. Pre-tipping point, those network forces aren't operating, and therefore there's a sparsity of companies at each of the stages of the life cycle. And I think for me, the job we have here in Scotland, and I imagine in many other similar ecosystems, is what interventions can we make that accelerate us beyond that point. Another observation I would make, and this might sound strange, but it's always better to have too few people in a company than too many. So we often tend to focus on the things we can see, like we must be being successful because I've got 200 people. Mm-hmm. But it gets back to agency a little bit. It's always better to grow more slowly if the market will allow you to, in terms of headcount. And it's always better to let that team mature, get really strong, get to know the strategy, than it is to just add people because it feels like you're being successful then. So never be ashamed to have too few of something. I think you get the best results when you're constrained in some way. You get more from people, etc. But insofar as some companies need to add people, then I think that it's not the number 105 or whatever it matters. It's that all the way through those levels of scale, we just don't have those type of companies that need that many people in sufficient number. one thing I would say about scaling a company is that, so I have a law which I'm reluctant to call Logan's law, but I'm going to just call it that anyway for now, which is that there's a geometric formula for when you're going to hit trouble in growth. And this is roughly how it works. So between 0 and, I'm going to say roughly 50 employees, but it can kick in earlier. But if it kicks in earlier, it doesn't conform to my law, therefore I'm not going to talk about that. Okay. But roughly, let's say 30 to 50 people. You add people, you get more stuff done, more outcomes, let's say. And actually that stage in growth is relatively easy. So to your question, Matt, you find a lot of 30-person companies or below that. Then you get to that 30 to 50, and you're still adding people, but you're not getting more outcomes. So you've hit an inflection point. And what's happening is that the things that used to work in the organization are now working against you. They're not neutral, they're actually working against you. But because they used to work, the temptation is to double down on them. Let's keep doing that because it used to work. So most startups in any ecosystem don't get past that first inflection point. They keep mini imploding. You know, that things are okay and then everyone falls out with each other and the founder leaves and they bring in somebody else and it mini implodes again and morale goes down and they keep micro imploding. So they either stay at that size or they decay. The companies that get through that point hit exactly the same problem at 100 employees roughly. And the ones that get through that hit at 200. So you see a sequence here, 50, 100, 200. Yeah. So there's actually a geometric progression. In fact, in Skyscanner, for example, we hit them at all those points plus 400, plus 800. So, you've got to understand what's going wrong there and what's happening in those kind of inflection points is that agency has collapsed. Because what is organization? Well, it's people and their capacity. So that's not static. The company grows. I used to be an engineer who could work well in a 2-person environment, but with 10 other engineers, I don't know how to operate, or I can't manage that many people or whatever. So it's people, it's structures which work well at one scale and break it at the next scale, and it's processes that do the same thing. So what happens at an inflection point is those 3 elements conspire in different combinations to scale out and break your organization. And you have to be prepared to change everything to get through those inflection points, and your North Star is this restoring agency? So I think the reason you're not seeing many of those companies is partly because we're hitting those agency inflection points.
And part of that's obviously education of those people in the company, for sure, right? Which is where you started this. But I'm kind of wondering, you made quite a big deal about education as bringing more people into computer science. How is that going to help? How does that help the ecosystem?
Well, if you think about the most important stage in the ecosystem, the precious raw material of startups are engineers and related roles, product people, marketing people, and so on. And to me, it's kind of self-evident that the more of those children at school you can switch on to the possibility of this career, the more startups you can have later. Obviously there's immigration, but this makes a significant contribution. And I remember my first forays into computing, which was quite late. I was a teenager, but it was quite late on for various reasons. And I was suddenly struck with the magic of this device that I could take thought and turn into substance, in the sense that I could get it to do, I thought magical things on my Amstrad 8086, but at the time they were magical, but maybe now not so much. But it's a magical medium. It's like painting and electricity. But at school level, we managed to take that magic away. So we switch off children from the subject. So I've gone through the syllabus here in Scotland, for example, and page to page, and there's a lot of stuff about the software lifecycle and what's in a functional spec. And I don't think that's what we should be teaching our children at this stage. We should be loading that course with how to make magic, lots more coursework and projects with industry, and light that flame that so many of us, I think, when we were younger had, because we had home computers or we had, those kind of things to access. So that's why it matters. And I think in essence why we're doing it not as well as we could is because we're somehow taking that magic away from our children, because we're making it an examinable subject. And examinable subjects require simple answers to simple questions. What's stage 5 of the software life cycle? What is a test spec?
But if you don't make it examinable, I'm not saying you're suggesting we don't make it examinable, but one of the other challenges I definitely see is I went to Glasgow University's kind of entrance requirements, and I had a brief look at some of them. If you look at, accountancy or biomedical engineering or chemistry, they say so many hires, which is the Scottish exam for people who are not in Scotland, and one of them has to be maths. So if you had to choose between studying maths or studying computer science, I'm not saying you should choose, but if you had to choose, you would clearly not choose computer science, because maths is generally useful in life, but it's also specifically useful in getting into university. And for a lot of people, school is about credentialing into university, not for everybody, but for a lot of people. So there is that kind of, it would be great to learn pottery or to be able to program, but at the end of the day, I've got to get my exams. So how do we solve that problem? Because it's not there yet, right? It's not an entrance requirement.
Well, I think a number of ways. It staggers me that in our economy here in Scotland, this is a pre-COVID figure, of course, but we have, by some estimates, 13,000 unfilled vacancies in computing every year. And those jobs pay way, way more than the average salary. The conservative estimate is 25% plus. And somehow our children aren't made aware of that when they're picking their subjects. That's the first problem. Second problem is that you can, in first year at school, you do history, you do geography as mandatory subjects, you do home economics as a mandatory subject, but computing science isn't there. Now, what message does that send about its importance? So I think that the reason you don't see it strongly represented is partly because we don't give it the importance at the early stages that it deserves. It's interesting that we wrestle with this problem in our country, but other countries have already solved it. And an interesting comment that a couple of heads of school at computing science departments and universities made to me during my report research is that one reason Brexit upsets them is we're going to lose all those great Eastern European students. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, they're better than the Scottish students. Not more intelligent, but they're coming out of schools that have taught them how to program. So because we've got to have a syllabus that caters for everybody, we start the computing science degree at basics. It's equivalent of starting a maths degree at, let's talk about algebra. Now, I think that tells me a number of things. It tells me that we better catch up with those other countries if we want to have a viable ecosystem later. And secondly, it can be done. And we've got to do it. We cannot make excuses about it. We've got to fix that problem. So, that's my view. And if we start from the idea that it's a journey, but should home economics be more important than computing science? Or should history be more important than computing science or geography? No disrespect to any of those subjects, are very valid subjects, but they shouldn't be more important at school level. If we fix that problem, we'll go some way towards making students want to do this subject later.
It's interesting because I wholeheartedly agree with you, and yet Code.org, which is this kind of like advocacy group for teaching computer science in school in America, they do a report every year. The 2019 report says that same thing in America, computing jobs are the number one source of new wages, and 9 out of 10 parents want their children to learn computer science. Okay, brilliant. But only 45% of high schools in the US teach computer science. They do not have a tech industry problem. So it seems totally incongruous.
I think immigration is the big answer there. When I first read your report, Mark, I think I told you at the time, I said it was Euclidean. And so this is a super interesting conversation. It's almost a kind of, I'll probably get this wrong, but like in a weird way, a reflection of your mind, of how you see these things. So that sort of geometrical law creation, the kind of, it's a really interesting mix of sort of Darwinistic, sort of natural science laws, number theory, but also the thing that's really in my mind the whole time during this conversation is that you said that sort of acceleration or that speed is taped to or tagged to the grief cycle. So there's a huge point of sort of human psychology in there as well. And I think that cascades down to your question, Matt, around what does education look like? Because frankly, we're talking about change again, right? We're talking about, hey, these subjects are traditional things that we've all agreed upon are super valuable and to that level, and here's a number against them, and we're going to, you know, quantify them into entry for further progress of our human existence, and we don't like the change bit. So I mean, this is all kind of, for me, leading up to this sort of concoction of different sort of thought patterns leads maybe into, might be a valuable bit to talk about, into sort of a, forgive me for saying, anti-fragility conversation as well, about talking about what's the value of change, what's the value of iteration, what's the fear point around change, and maybe against the backdrop of COVID-19 as well. I think we're seeing those kind of changes, those big scale changes in society. We're seeing the high streets being emptied, and, you know, all sorts of redistributions of human capital in different areas. So I think it might be. Have you got a view on anti-fragility and ecosystems?
I do, and you know, the way I would look at this is that, you know, so what does anti-fragility mean? In summary, it's the opposite of fragile, which is if you apply a stressor to a system, it gets stronger with anti-fragility, not weaker. And I think that you see that, for example, very much in the Silicon Valley, where before a technology is even fully exploited, they're already moving on and tearing it down. And when a business fails, the people in that business take their skills and hard-won experiences to another business, and it gets stronger. And I think in Scotland, you know, back in the 80s, for example, we were celebrating the Silicon Glen, as it was called. And what that really was a lot of imported, really cool companies, you know, Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, IBM, many others, and we're grateful to have those jobs. But that was a fragile system. As soon as the economic cycle turned over, they all left, basically. And we didn't have hundreds or thousands of startups that were going through that Darwinian process of, you know, of growth. So we need a balanced ecosystem that has lots of representation in the early stages, because that ecosystem, those earlier layers, will survive shocks. You know, if a market changes, if something different comes along, they'll flex with that. You know, is blockchain where to put your money? Is it somewhere else? You know, what strands of AI? Government doesn't need to solve that in an anti-fragile ecosystem. It solves it for itself, and all government has to do is support emerging clusters. If that helps, then create a talent attraction mechanism outside. So I think anti-fragility is one of the goals of our exercise here. But, you know, just on that other point you made about you know, this all comes down to the rate of human acceptance of change. I think that's a super important observation, and I do think that human acceptance of change looks very different when you're, as I was saying earlier, you're driving that change. Now, what have we seen recently? Well, we've seen people recognise a crisis and, without any direction from above, as it were, drive change in many aspects of our society, because we feel a sense of crisis. And I think this is the greatest opportunity we've had as a nation, as an ecosystem, to get on with stuff, because it's aligning our thinking. And, you know, to bring in another physical law, since you were talking about it, we know the second law of thermodynamics, which is energy in a system is conserved, or more popularly, that you can't create or destroy energy. But you can create and destroy human energy. You can do it in companies. You know, a great, you know, leader in a company will create so much energy, and a bad leader will kill it. But the way you really create energy is you enable your front line to go solve the problems. Now, we're in a situation just now where I would say in Scotland we've got a higher number of higher quality and more ambitious founders than we maybe ever had since the great days of the shipbuilding industry in Scotland. And our opportunity is to create the conditions that let them exploit that potential. And I think the energy is there in that group. I think the energy is in government to want to do it. I've been very impressed with the response of government to the report that we've been talking about earlier, and the speed they're moving. And the energy is certainly there in the supporting members of our industry. So I think we can create energy right now, and we can iterate more quickly than perhaps we have in the past, because people won't be acting according to a grief cycle where things are done to them, they have to respond. They'll be driving that change across a much wider breadth of people than we've seen before. And, you know, a lot of people could be cynical to that view, which I understand. But, you know, I in the words of that great Australian William Wallace, I believe we can do it, and I think we will.
Very good.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting. I definitely think there's a moment as an opportunity. I mean, when you put it in terms of the change, I mean, we've had change thrust upon us, but it does create opportunity. I mean, economically, I think we certainly want to make tech more successful in this country. I think socially, we've got a journey to go on to put it in its place of aspiration, because like you look what's happened in other places. In America now, if you're a bright young thing, you don't waltz off now to Wall Street. You decide to go and take a tech job. And we don't do a good enough job yet, and we need to really work on this, of saying this is an amazing career to get into. And here are the superstars in Scotland, of which, Mark, you are definitely one of them. Stephen, I might say you're one too.
What? No, I was just thinking, I recently spoke to this guy who works for Turkey's largest bank, and he was saying the biggest problem they're meeting now is that they just can't hire anymore. And you just brought that to the front of mind, because it's the same Wall Street problem. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is it's not just a kind of West Coast versus East Coast of the US. It's in all sorts of emergent spaces that this place is attracting, you know, the most talented people. It's always so hard to look at that from a societal lens, and you know, to be clear, the whole, you know, just talking about unicorns and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of space, to your point as well, about, you know, creating several companies that have got 105 employees. I think from my perspective, and why we did the podcast, frankly, is just to expose people to those kind of ideas and to lend them some kind of voice. Sometimes I worry that people think entrepreneurs are just kind of, you know, sort of fake, you know, sort of like
grubby failures.
Yeah, or sort of like even business people for that matter. And because the definition of, or the close your eyes and what pictures you have in your head of a business person changes from location to location. What clothes do they wear? What, you know, what bad decisions they make? What good decisions do they make, etc. So I think for us, I think we're all three of us probably agreed on this, is really just exposing people to thoughts around this, exposing people to how things can be done, what the language looks like, and then to inject some energy into it. And I think the grief cycle thing, really, you've really, I can't stop thinking about it. I think the cycle we're hitting now within society is this weird place that's in many cases pretty sad and pretty devastating. But there are pockets of people thinking, hey, this is a moment of opportunity. This is a moment where we can change things a little bit and have a go at things, and that extends to, you know, Black Lives Matters, and it extends to all sorts of parts of society where things are being sort of rethought and sort of sort of contextualized, and people are just having a go at stuff. And I think, you know, from my perspective, I think the size of Scotland is super interesting to see if that could be nurtured and be done quite quickly, because it's sort of easily connectable.
Yeah, I do feel that for the first time in my life, we do stand as a species on a critical point in the journey, and I think that people sense that we can either begin the descent of humankind, or we can stop the behaviours and stop the processes that are leading to the risk of that descent. And this is one of these moments. So I don't like using the word opportunity when I'm very conscious that many of my fellow citizens are in great distress, and I think we're all conscious of that. So I don't mean that, great, it's an opportunity to exploit and to hell with everybody else. I mean, there's a crisis upon us, and I think we all feel that if we don't act urgently, not just to put out the current flames of distress that are around us, but to build for the future, if we don't create a bridge to opportunity for our young people, for example, as they come out of school, and if we don't help people from industries that are struggling to move into industries that might have growth potential, if we don't take that responsibility, then we are essentially admitting that the only way is down. And I don't think we want to admit that just now. So I think that's the opportunity I'm talking about, to exploit that feeling. And, we talk about tech. I think there's always this little risk in the back of people's heads or this little concern, this little voice that says, can we really do this? Can we create enough successful companies and so on? But I think we have every disadvantage we need to succeed here. That it's going to be hard. It's not precedented, particularly in recent times, or it was in the past. But I think it's those reasons those disadvantages rather, that will make us try harder, that will make us settle our differences and not sling mud across a fence when we're actually both on the same side of it. Yeah. So I think that I'm feeling, and I might be wrong here, but I really feel, for example, in the response to the report we've published, which is not a profound report, it says things that lots of people have been saying for a long time and just writes them down. But I feel the response is overwhelming. The industry wants to do something, the government wants to do something, education wants to play its part. Talking about how do you fix education at computing science, just listen to the teachers. The morale is low just now because they're not getting listened to. Let's listen to them. They'll move incredibly fast in response. So I think this is a moment amidst all these difficulties which is the best time to make big progress here, and I sense that we want to as a nation, and I sense that we will actually convert that.
Good stuff. I think it's a good place to wrap up. Mark, thanks so much for being on the show. Really, really enjoyed it. And yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It was great talking with you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Startupification. If you have any feedback, you can contact us at startupification.fm/feedback. And if you want to support the show, please consider writing us a review on Apple Podcasts. It's a small thing you can do, but it really helps other people find the show. Special thanks to Ollie Littlejohn, who edited and produced today's episode, and to Stephen Coleman, who wrote and performed our music.